Hey y'all, it's David Ducker coming back at you, and today I'm going to be talking about open-ended stories. I've got a lot of feedback from my campaign tripod videos, the railroading your sandbox video, my just my regular sandbox versus railroad video. Uh, and I often get into arguments with people where they accuse me of railroading. And I don't mind that if I am railroading, sure. But not 90, let's say 90% of the time I run a sandbox, and then the other 10% I'm running a one shot, so I don't have time for a sandbox, so I railroad. But a lot of people, when they hear that my sandbox has a story, they say, "Oh, that's not a sandbox, then that's a railroad." A sandbox is a large area where you just wander around and do random things and side quests, and then it trails off and ends. That seems to be their definition of a sandbox. That's not my definition of a sandbox, or at least it doesn't have to be. My sandboxes do have a story, but they're not railroads because the story is open-ended. And I was talking to a gentleman about this who gave me a great example. My campaigns often tend to be about war. Especially Civil War, because you get great role-playing out of that. So I've used that example, but I was talking to a gentleman, and he had a different example, so I'm going to use that, where he ran a campaign about the schism within a religion. And you could argue this is kind of like a war, and it's like a holy civil war. So it's still similar, but it's different enough for our purposes. So for him, that was the story of his sandbox. There's a schism within the religion, much like Lutheranism within Christianity, and how Protestants separated out from the Catholic Church. And I said that's a great example of an open-ended sandbox story. You know, whose side are the players on? You introduce them to the theology and to both sides. Then, when they're informed and they know exactly what's going on, because they've been exploring, not because you've been running them through a series of things, but because they're exploring and everybody's talking about it. Everybody. That's why it's a story for the whole sandbox, because it's such a big issue. Everyone cares locally. Whatever local is for you, if it's a whole kingdom, if it's just a village, however big your sandbox is, the story of the sandbox is the biggest story in it that affects the most people. Right? So everybody's talking about it. Then we come to a critical moment, the moment of truth, when they choose a side. Are they going to stick with the Catholic Church, or are they going to go out with Martin Luther? Are they going to say the Pope is God's only representative on earth? Or are they going to say God is in the heart of every man? You know, that's a tough question. That's a big question. And it's really interesting to role play through that question. And then they make the decision. Whatever it is, they choose their side, and then they help their side, and they hurt the enemy until the story is over, and you have that final climactic battle between the two sides. Whether it's a court case, like they're going to burn Joan of Arc, and you've got to come in and prove that they shouldn't because of Lutheranism, whatever it is, you have a climactic moment that determines the fate of this whole issue and argument. And it could be a battle, a siege, an assassination. If the Pope bleeds, he is not a true avatar in this setting. And thus, we must assassinate the Pope. You know, we got to get through the Pope-mobile. Maybe blow up the Pope-mobile, whatever it is you're doing. So you get the exposition where they're wandering and they're learning. Then you have what's basically the inciting incident, which is their choice of which side that they're on. And then we have like rising action as the two sides fight, and they can still be wandering in this sandbox. What does this Baron think? What does the Duke over here think? Let's visit the Archbishop of Canterbury and try to convert him to Lutheranism. Man, if an Archbishop throws down his frock, what's that going to mean for Lutheranism? You know, and they can go wherever they want, because I've prepped the sandbox. I know where everybody is, who everybody is. I can roleplay as any of them. So I can just wander around and explore this story, this issue, this open-ended, non-linear story. And then eventually, You want to have that big moment, that climax, right? And then you say the end and it's over. And you can do a sequel to it if you want, but you'll have to re-prep and get a new story for the sequel. So that's what I mean by a story in a sandbox. It's an open-ended story. It's not the story of how the Pope destroyed Lutheranism. It's the story of how they struggled, but the end is left in doubt because the players determine the end. If they succeed, if they fail, what side they're on, what their argument is. If they bring all these supporters, they're probably going to win. If they alienate everyone, murder hobo style, their side is going to lose, almost guaranteed. You know, and if they're the minority and they win, democracy says that that's evil. So, I mean, your game could be about democracy versus tyranny. And most people are evil, so maybe democracy's evil in your game. Whatever you want to do, whatever open-ended story you want to explore, you can do it. And you can have that central story in a sandbox. And people don't seem to understand this, which is why I did my sandbox versus railroad video, and why I did my sandbox, putting the rails in your sandbox video as well. But I still get harassed about this, so I'm going to do this video about open-ended stories in specific, what they are, how to do them. And of course, you know, and I've done other videos on this, but it's very important that you make a character who's interested in this story. If your character is an atheist or he's not very religious, he might not care. That's not a good character for this campaign. You know, Lutheranism versus Catholicism. You don't want someone who doesn't care. By definition, one of the power players, a player character, a protagonist of this story is by definition going to care about this story. One way or the other, doesn't matter, but he has to care, right? So if your story is about democracy versus tyranny, and your character's not very political, he doesn't really care, maybe that's not the best character for this story. You know, you need to design a character who's interested. Just in the exact same way that you need to design a character who fits the setting. You can't have a Klingon in Star Wars, and you can't have a Vulcan show up in the middle of the Justice League. You know, it doesn't fit the setting. And that's just as bad if you show up with someone who doesn't fit the story. And again, if somebody doesn't fit into the team, even if you fit the story, if you're not going to form a team, a tight team, baby, it doesn't matter. You know, your character can be really interesting, but if he's off by himself and he's not in the story, in the setting, like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We can't use him. He's great at what he does. We're not doing that thing. We can't use him. That's all an aside, though. I just wanted to talk about open-ended stories. So it's the story of this, and we don't have an ending. We've got to explore the themes, pick a side, and then fight for our ending, earn our happy ending. So I encourage you all to do that with your sandbox. Don't have this sandbox where you wander around, you do a bunch of random things, and it just trails off. You need to have that beginning, middle, and end, the catharsis, the character development. The story is what the characters are all talking about. It's what they all care about. It's the common thread that binds the campaign together. You know, so make sure you have that common thread. You know, if you're 10 years later describing to someone what happened in your campaign, it should all be bound together as a story, one singular story, one issue, and it needs, you know, and it needs to be complex enough for your length. We run for a whole year, so we need some complexity. If you're running for 5 years, you need a really complex issue with many facets to explore. If you're running for a one-shot, you know, it can be so simplistic that it's a railroad. Or if you're running for 3 months, it might be a very, very simple issue as well. So anyway, those are my thoughts on that. Let me know what you think about open-ended stories, about Sandbox and Railroad, how they compete, how they blend, and leave that in the comments below or the comments section of one of those other videos. Because because it's a big topic and it's required a lot of videos so far for people to understand. Until I see you again, though, good day and good gaming.